Good morning. The Subcommittee on Energy will now come to order. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The Trump administration proposed to zero out the Energy Star program earlier this year. It got people talking. Many manufacturers said Energy Star is worth saving, but that there's room for improvement. This is a discussion draft. I repeat, discussion draft. It offers possible solutions, and I repeat, possible solutions and reforms. It would make the DOE the lead energy for Energy Star while requiring them to consult with EPA. Today, each administration can choose whether EPA or DOE runs the show. This is an energy program, which is why some want the Department of Energy in the driver's seat. This draft also has liability protections like what's in a bill by my friends Bob Latta from Ohio and Peter Welch from Vermont. Energy Star has its own penalties for those who break the rules. We don't need more lawyers involved on top of that. And I say that as a member of the Texas Bar and active with a UT law degree on my wall. This draft also creates more chances for industry input in the program. I look forward to hearing thoughts about any and all sections. One other point. Last Friday, our Democrat colleagues sent a letter asking to delay this hearing because they wanted a government panel. You should know that staff tried but couldn't get the appropriate witnesses. We need to have a high-level panel with live bodies confirmed by the Senate. Our friends there have to move forward. But both EPA and DOE have submitted statements and comments, and we'll respond to any questions for the record that they get. And we'll remind them that they need to be prompt with their answers. At this point, I'd like to bounce my time to Mr. Latta, who's been a leader on these issues for years.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for yielding. And to our panel witnesses today, thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it for this discussion that we're going to have today. The Energy Star program has been a win-win for consumers and manufacturers over the past 25 years. This program has proven to be a successful tool in advancing the development and use of efficient energy technologies. It has also promoted economic expansion and job growth for participating manufacturers across the nation, including many across my home state of Ohio. This hearing today is a starting point for reforming the Energy Star program. We've heard from stakeholders that reforms are needed to the Energy Star and that this draft is an opportunity to discuss those ideas. I want today to be a step in the process toward building a strong bill that shows support for this program while making the necessary changes that we need. I'm looking forward to the testimony. I hope that the engagement of these issues will not stop after today's hearing. We need to hear from all the stakeholders about reform ideas so that we can move this package forward. I have an open door policy, and I hope that anyone who is interested will share their thoughts, concerns, and suggestions with me. One provision in the draft directly addresses a recent trend that has led to a chilled participation in the program. This language protects manufacturers falling out of compliance if they have complied with all corrective measures and penalties from litigation related to noncompliance. The draft also moves the primary responsibility of the program to the Department of Energy, since the heart of this program is helping consumers make energy-efficient choices. Additionally, we look at opportunities for more transparency and public engagement in the standard-setting process. The Energy Star program is widely recognized by consumers and has seen major investments by the manufacturing community over the past 2 decades. The updates we are considering today are important for ensuring that this program remains strong. I want to again thank the committee for holding today's hearing, and I also look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now the chair calls upon a man who's very happy that my Houston Astros took the place of his Chicago Cubs as the World Series champs, the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I've never been introduced like that before, and I'm stunned with that introduction. But thank you anyway, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you know, Ranking Member Pallone and myself, we sent a letter to you and Chairman Walden on Friday asking that this hearing be postponed until representatives from the EPA and from the DOE were made available to testify before this subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, it's highly unusual and wholly unacceptable that we are now in the month of November and the administration witnesses have been allowed to repeatedly thumb their noses at requests made by this subcommittee to get them to come here and to testify before the representatives of the American people. Mr. Chairman, I am deeply, very deeply concerned and disturbed that this subcommittee seems to be completely feckless in persuading administrative officials to provide testimony on pending legislation and to engage members in person, as has been the tradition of this subcommittee for as long as I can remember and for as long as I have been on this subcommittee. At some point very soon, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we will use all the power available to us to convince representatives of this administration to answer our call when they receive invitations from the subcommittee to come before us. Mr. Chairman, I think it does not do us well for us to continue to accept these refusals to come before this subcommittee, to continue to accept this disrespect and disregard for members of this subcommittee. And Mr. Chairman, to me, it's the epitome of foolhardiness for us to continue to give these government officials from this administration mammy-pammy excuses for not coming here before this subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, I can only imagine the howls and the growls and the threats that we would have heard from your side of the aisle if former administrators, EPA administrators, Gina McCarthy or Lisa Jackson would have simply refused to either show up in person or even send a representative in their place to answer members' questions. Mr. Chairman, I think it is time to bring this kind of disregard and disrespect to a screeching halt, and I hope that you and the Republican members of this subcommittee will be as outraged at this inaction and at this disrespect from the administration. Show up before us, and let's have some real discussion about policy. Mr. Chairman, as for these two bills before us, I support H.R. 3477, the Ceiling Fan Energy Conservation Harmonization Act, and I strongly oppose the Energy Star Reform Act of 2017. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield right now the balance of my time to the gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. This Energy Star draft is a step, and I appreciate the intent of the drafters. Energy Star has had 25 years of fantastic success. It's done a lot since 1992 on a voluntary program, saving consumers in businesses, $430 billion on their utility bills, and reducing carbon emissions by 3 billion metric tons. And I appreciate the work of Mr. Walden, Mr. Upton, and Mr. Latta, who I've worked with very, very closely in putting this draft out there. I appreciate the effort of Mr. Latta to maintain the development of energy efficiency appliances through Energy Star by preventing the need for class action, something he and I have worked on. That said, here's the concerns I have about proposed changes in the current draft that I hope we can address. I think moving the program from EPA to DOE is a significant issue. Instituting the Administrative Procedure Act standards and allowing for self-certification of certain products, all of these, in my view, could be detrimental to the continued effectiveness of this program. So I look forward to working with my colleagues. This is a bipartisan effort, and I thank the authors of the draft legislation for getting us moving. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair, responding to the ranking member's concerns about the people ignoring this committee. Remind my good friend, it took us 10 months to have our first cabinet secretary, Rick Perry, speak before this committee. The problem is not this committee. It's a slow confirmation process in the Senate. We tried to get witnesses, we tried, but there's none available that have the stature we need to do our job. And so we're going forward. With that, I yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes opening statement.
Well, I thank the gentleman and appreciate his comments. That is what we face. We share the frustration the minorities expressed today about the inability to have the administration's witnesses or administration's people confirmed by the Senate and in place, so we would have somebody that can give us the administration's perspective on these matters of legislation. Our committee's energy focus is not limited to energy production and delivery, as you all know. We're also interested in policies that promote energy efficiency. Doing more with less is always a win for consumers, for manufacturers, for jobs, the environment, and for the economy overall. H.R. 3477, the Ceiling Fan Energy Conservation Harmonization Act, authored by my good friend from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, is one of the two bills that we will examine today. This legislation would align the compliance date of the next efficiency standard for ceiling fans with the compliance date for ceiling fan lights, so the manufacturers can deal with both at the same time. What a concept. Amazing we have to pass legislation to fix something like this. Shifting gears, I believe the Energy Star program is a nice complement to the mandatory federal energy efficiency standards for many energy-using products, in that it helps consumers identify those models that go above and beyond the minimum standards. I know I look at that, and my wife does when we buy different appliances and things. It's a guide. But surveys show that consumers are aware of the Energy Star label and that many of them look for it when making their purchasing decisions. In addition to appliances, Energy Star also helps building owners and renters save on energy. The Energy Star program received a great deal of attention earlier this year when the administration's FY 2018 budget proposed to zero out the program. I certainly disagreed with this approach, but I do believe the program could be improved upon, and now's a great time to kick off that dialogue. Today's hearing will focus on our discussion draft of Energy Star reforms. Keep in mind, this is just a draft. We welcome constructive criticisms of what it contains, as well as suggestions for things that we should add onto it. One of the quirks of the Energy Star program is that it has no permanent lead agency. Each new administration can decide how to divide responsibilities between the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Administration or agency. And in 2009, the Obama administration shifted the lead to EPA. In my mind, Energy Star is fundamentally an energy program and belongs at the Department of Energy. But I understand that many participants in the program are happy with it being at EPA now. The discussion draft proposes to make DOE the lead agency while still giving EPA an important role. But again, I stress that this is just a discussion draft, and we welcome all comments on how the program should be structured. As I mentioned, Energy Star is a well-functioning program overall, but there are areas for improvement. The discussion draft addresses some of these, such as protections against unhelpful class action litigation, as well as assurances that companies have a chance to comment on major actions under the program. It also has provisions to help safeguard consumer choice. I'd also like to note that thoughtful legislating often takes time. This is the first of what I'm sure will be several hearings and markups on legislation. Today's hearing is focused on our discussion draft and is yet to be formally introduced. I'm looking forward to receiving feedback again from all the stakeholders, including EPA and DOE, as we continue to move through the legislative process. As we discuss potential changes to the program, we can't lose sight that consumers are the reason for the Energy Star, and that the focus should always be on what's best for the consumer. Any ideas that improve the process by which consumers get the information they can use to save on their energy bills is something we would like to hear about. So I thank the witnesses for participating in this hearing. Look forward to your testimony. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chairman yields back. The chair now calls upon the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing will look at two pieces of legislation relating to energy efficiency, a very troubling discussion draft entitled the Energy Star Reform Act of 2017, and another bill, H.R. 3477, the Ceiling Fan Energy Conservation Harmonization Act, that seems to have no opposition. But before I discuss the legislation, I must say that it's totally unacceptable to have a legislative hearing on a bill that will make major changes to the Energy Star program without witnesses from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's blatant refusal to participate in our committee's legislative process has been a common theme since President Trump took office in January. It's now November, and we're expected to believe that there is not a single person at EPA who can discuss the impact of a bill that completely moves the Energy Star program to DOE. I've looked at the committee records, and both the Obama and Bush administrations were able to get EPA witnesses, including the administrator, up here within 3 months of taking office. And it's been almost 10 months now, and this committee has yet to have a single EPA witness before us, and that's simply unacceptable. If the administration's absence is due to a scheduling conflict, then today's hearing should have been postponed. But if they're just refusing to appear before our committee to discuss any legislative proposal, then we should not accept that. On Friday, Ranking Member Rush and I asked that this hearing be postponed until we could have both EPA and DOE before us. Clearly, that did not happen, but I would hope that committee Republicans would join us in saying enough is enough. The days of the administration hiding are over. It's time that they appear before us so that we can hear their thoughts on the legislation that we are considering. Now let me move to one of the bills before us. I have serious concerns with the Energy Star Reform Act of 2017 discussion draft, which makes several significant changes to the Energy Star program. And I have one question: what problem are we trying to solve with this proposal? The Energy Star program is extremely successful, reducing energy consumption and saving consumers money. According to EPA, in 2014 alone, this completely voluntary program saved consumers $34 billion on their utility bills while stopping the release of 300 million metric tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This program is a win-win for consumers and the environment. And yet this bill is proposing major changes, including taking the program out of EPA and moving it to DOE. Energy Star was originally established at EPA, and the program was codified into law with EPA as the co-lead agency in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was produced by a Republican Congress and President. It remains an extremely effective and popular volunteer program, so again, why the need for a change? I have yet to hear a credible argument from anyone as to why this is necessary. The discussion draft also requires that product certifications and other program specifications be done using the Administrative Procedure Act process, which would require every product certification to be published in the Federal Register and be subject to public notice and comment. And I worry that this will make the program less nimble and harm both consumers and companies by opening the process to new needless litigation from companies who otherwise couldn't meet Energy Star standards. Two other provisions in the draft would harm consumers who purchase products under this popular program. The no warranty subsection would create a liability shield, blocking consumers from recovering costs when the Energy Star labeled product they bought turns out to be mislabeled and doesn't achieve the energy savings promised. And another provision would allow companies to once again deem their products to be energy efficient with little to no outside verification of those claims. GAO warned us back in 2010 that the Energy Star program was vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse due to its self-certification policy. So EPA implemented reforms, including a third-party certification program, to ensure products with the Energy Star label actually save energy. Rolling back this critical reform would endanger the long-term viability of the Energy Star program. It's particularly reckless when combined with the liability shield because it would leave consumers with no outside verification of manufacturer claims while removing a critical avenue for consumers to make whole if the manufacturer's claims prove to be wrong. So again, Energy Star is a program that enjoys broad support from American consumers, manufacturers, and efficiency advocates. It's a voluntary program, and companies can choose not to participate. The changes in this draft would undermine the integrity of the Energy Star label, incentivize companies to cheat the system, and allow bad actors who lie about the efficiency of their products to get off scot-free. In all of these scenarios, consumers are left paying the price for the legislative mistakes proposed in this draft. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, yields back. We have now concluded with member opening statements. Chair would like to remind all members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. And we want to thank our witnesses for being here on this cold day and take the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements followed by a round of questions from members. These statements are limited to 5 minutes. You'll have a green light. At 1 minute left, you'll have a yellow light. And at 5 minutes, you'll have the red light. Our witness panel today includes, first of all, Mr. Joseph M. McGuire, the President and CEO of the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. You have 5 minutes, Mr. McGuire. Hit the button microphone there.
Save some seconds there. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the future of Energy Star. The Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers represents the producers of the vast majority of home appliances purchased by U.S. consumers. Our members are strong supporters of the Energy Star program. AHAM has significant experience with the Energy Star program, having worked closely with EPA and DOE since the program's inception for home appliances in 1996. AHAM is an Energy Star verification testing body approved by both agencies. Because the Energy Star brand is known to more than 80% of consumers nationwide, AHAM strongly supports maintenance of the program within the federal government. This program should not be privatized or eliminated. The program should be adequately funded, but we strongly believe the program should be improved in recognition of its significant role in the marketplace. Energy efficiency gains across core major appliance categories have been dramatic over the past decades. A new clothes washer today uses 70% less energy than it did in 1990 and less than half the water. Energy Star has played a critical role in educating consumers on the benefits of energy efficiency, and it has become so ubiquitous that it is now referenced in building codes as part of utility rebates, federal procurement, and retail buyer specifications. Thus, the voluntary program has effectively become mandatory in the marketplace. As such, manufacturers must make significant investment decisions to qualify products for the program, just as they must invest for products to comply with mandatory appliance efficiency standards. The Energy Star program for home appliances originally was administered by DOE so that critical coordination with appliance standards and test procedures could occur. However, in 2009, the program was transferred from DOE to EPA. The lack of expertise within EPA has led to complications with verification testing requirements, and EPA officials began to broaden the scope of the program into non-energy related product requirements such as product performance and warranty terms. This expansion has added considerable confusion for manufacturers and diminishes the brand. Energy Star has drifted from its original mission and operates at many levels as if it were still an experimental program. More than 25 years from its creation, the Energy Star program is a fully matured, de facto mandatory federal program that needs additional statutory authorization to keep it focused and to create long-term stability and certainty. It must maintain its focus on its intended and sole purpose, energy efficiency. To address these concerns, AHAM proposes the following. First, move the Energy Star for home appliances from EPA back to DOE and provide funding for a reform program. I believe Secretary Perry was receptive to this suggestion when he appeared before this committee recently. While Energy Star can be transferred back to DOE administratively, and we support that, a statutory requirement to house the program at DOE will keep it from becoming a ping-pong ball. We respectfully suggest that the draft bill indicate that authority over the Energy Star program be held by DOE and, except for home appliances covered under EPCA, may be delegated to EPA as determined by the Secretary. Secondly, we support the bill's provision to increase transparency and long-term certainty of the program by establishing Administrative Procedure Act process requirements. There should be a formal and transparent process for changing and developing Energy Star specifications for all stakeholders. The APA will not slow down the Energy Star processes. Finally, we support the draft bill's provision to stop Energy Star class action lawsuits that undercut fair enforcement by the federal government. Because Energy Star has its own remedies, allowing class actions undermines the program and fosters a system of double jeopardy for Energy Star partners. Congress should make clear it does not intend this program to be used for that purpose. Our members must earn the trust of consumers each and every day, as our products are so vital to their well-being. We look forward to working with the committee to improve the Energy Star processes and make the program stronger to deliver reliable energy efficiency tools to consumers purchasing home appliances. On behalf of our industry, I'd like to thank the subcommittee for its work on this issue, including this draft bill, and I respectfully request that my written statement be included as part of the hearing record. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Without objection, so ordered, and thank you, Mr. McGuire. The chair now calls upon Kateri Callahan, the president of the Alliance to Save Energy. I'm sorry if I butchered that first name with a thick Texas drawl, but...
Sir, you did it just right, and a Kentucky drawl appreciates that Texas drawl. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Alliance to Save Energy, which is a nonprofit coalition comprised of over 130 different businesses and organizations. And I would note that all the witnesses before you today are members of the Alliance to Save Energy's Associates Program, and our businesses represent about $870 billion in market cap. We were founded way back in 1977 by Senators Chuck Percy of Illinois and Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, and our bipartisan heritage has continued the 40 years since. Today, we have 15 members of Congress who serve in an honorary capacity on our board, representing both sides of the Capitol and both sides of the aisle, and I'm just honored and delighted that 5 members of this committee serve on the Alliance's honorary board, including Dr. Burgess, Mr. Kinzinger, Mr. McKinley, Mr. Tonko, and Mr. Welch. We thank them for their support. The Alliance's history with the Energy Star program is long. We supported the creation of the program, and we worked then with the Congress, with EPA, DOE, and all the Energy Star partners to keep the voluntary program both robust and impactful. For this reason, we very much appreciate and applaud the subcommittee members and staff for fully engaging all the key stakeholder groups as you seek to craft legislation that will impact this program. While we are open to continuing to improve the program, we have to caution the subcommittee to be very careful to assure that there are no unintended negative consequences as you consider changes. As many have already mentioned and as detailed in my testimony, and those of other businesses and organizations that are offering comment on the discussion draft, Energy Star today is a venerable program. It is widely recognized as the world's gold standard for public-private partnerships. More than 90% of Americans recognize and trust that familiar blue label. Energy cost savings to consumers have grown to over $430 billion, and we're still counting. The program has driven $165 billion in private sector investment in new technology and innovation. 10% of the homes built today are built and proudly display the Energy Star label, and over 50% of the commercial building floor space, 50%, is using the Energy Star Portfolio Manager to monitor and control energy consumption. I think it was Mr. Pallone who mentioned this, but if the old adage ever stood true, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that's the case for today's Energy Star program, and it should be the test against which the subcommittee determines the content of any bill that will impact its future. Our greatest concerns with the discussion draft are twofold: the proposed wholesale move of the program from EPA to DOE and the application of the Administrative Procedures Act, or APA. We oppose a wholesale move of the Energy Star program from EPA to DOE. As Joe said, such a shift in responsibility for parts of the programs can be done, and the flexibility is there under current law for EPA and DOE to assign or reassign responsibilities to assure the most effective and streamlined management of the program. So we encourage the stakeholders and the committee to look to the administration to move any parts that may make the most sense over and back and forth between the two agencies. We also oppose the broad application of the APA, which was designed and intended for regulatory programs that carry the force of law, not voluntary programs like the Energy Star. We do believe, however, that there should be adequate transparency and predictability to the specification setting process for Energy Star products, and we'd very much like to work with the agencies and the subcommittee to consider provisions that can accomplish this goal. The Alliance appreciates the efforts made by the subcommittee to reduce costs for manufacturers that are in good standing to the program, But we do not support an exemption of third-party certification for only certain manufacturers of consumer electronic devices. We stand ready to work with the subcommittee, EPA, and its partners to consider options that could lower certification costs for all manufacturers who are in good standing. Finally, the Alliance does support the discussion draft provision to explicitly put in a no warranty clause to defend against class action suits. In our experience, the agencies have actively enforced specification compliance and have delisted products and assessed penalties in an appropriate fashion. In conclusion, I would note, as other members of the committee have, that the subcommittee's deliberations are coming at a time when the Energy Star program is under threat of elimination by the administration and significant budget cuts by the Congress. We urge the subcommittee, therefore, to continue to work closely with all of us who support this gold standard public-private partnership and make sure that the program has the congressional support, it has the guidance, and very importantly, it has the funding it needs to continue to deliver the enormous energy and dollar savings that American consumers and businesses have come to expect from the Energy Star label. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And as the people of Kentucky and Texas say, much obliged. Our next witness is Mr. Greg Merritt. Greg is Vice President at CREE. So you have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning. I'd like to thank the committee, chairman, and ranking member for the opportunity to speak to you today. Cree is a U.S.-based developer and producer of advanced technology LEDs, LED lighting products, and power and wireless semiconductor components. We are headquartered in North Carolina and have facilities in Wisconsin, Arkansas, and California, with over 6,000 employees worldwide. Our technologies, product, and solutions are all focused on advancing energy-efficient improvements across the lighting, communications, electric transportation, renewable energy, and energy storage industries. We helped to launch what we called the LED lighting revolution over 10 years ago, and have witnessed firsthand the important role Energy Star has played in helping guide consumers to higher quality, energy-efficient products, driving adoption by facilitating rebates and incentive programs, and providing a trusted brand among the confusion of new technologies and many unknown manufacturers, which, by the way, included Cree in those early days. Energy Star continues to be a trusted brand to consumers and a valued partner to suppliers like Cree. The program's remarkable success is undeniable, as you've heard earlier. And as a marketing executive, I will tell you that there are many companies around the world that would envy a 90% brand recognition that Energy Star enjoys today. This brand is an incredible value asset, and we should fiercely protect it. As a participating Energy Star company with over 400 Energy Star rated products, Cree is very supportive of changes that will improve the program and help secure its future, but is also wary of those that may do otherwise. Our foremost interest, and I think you've heard this earlier, is to ensure that Energy Star is fully funded, retains its experienced and capable staff and management, and continues to deliver multiple valued programs, including product certification for commercial buildings and homes. Furthermore, we would advocate specific authorization of funding to ensure that the appropriated levels going forward are adequate to keep the program strong and viable, and at least match historical levels of funding. Among the proposals included in discussion draft we're adjusting today, we are particularly concerned by the proposed transfer of the program to DOE and the proposal to apply the Administrative Procedures Act to the development of Energy Star specifications. We believe a wholesale transfer of the program to DOE threatens to severely disrupt funding, staffing, and operations. And while there are always improvements that can be made, and we believe they can be made under the existing structure, we believe Energy Star is running smoothly and is well managed at EPA. EPA has a talented team of professionals, years of institutional knowledge and experience, not to mention established and strong working relationships with the 16,000 Energy Star partners. We are therefore opposed to moving Energy Star to DOE, an agency that does not have the budget authority, appropriations, or staff who are trained and experienced in the critical marketing, brand management, and partnership aspects of this important program. As for the proposal to apply the APA to Energy Star specifications, we are adamantly opposed. We believe this proposal would add unnecessary, time-consuming, and burdensome regulation, and process to a voluntary program that by its very nature must be nimble, flexible, and responsive to rapidly changing products, technologies, and markets. We believe imposing APA will eliminate the ability of program staff to make quick adjustments to the specification that may be necessary in response to technology evolution, and the program will forever be chasing technology and market evolution, rendering it ineffective. I would also note that recent experience with Energy Star, at least by my company, have reflected improved engagement of product manufacturers in the specification process, multiple rounds of comment and drafts, and many of these have been in response to our earlier request to EPA. We would also be opposed to providing exemptions for specific manufacturers or products from third-party certification. Third-party certification was added to the program to prevent bad actors from misusing the program with products that don't meet Energy Star standards, depriving consumers of their promised savings. We believe allowing exemptions would create the opportunity for this bad behavior to happen. While external testing does create a longer process and add some cost, we believe it is a necessary and worthwhile trade-off. The trustworthiness of the Energy Star certification and label is the most valuable attribute of the program, and it should not be risked for convenience. Finally, while we don't have a firm position on the warranty provision, we would oppose it if it is paired with exemptions from third-party certifications for the reasons I eliminated above. Thank you very much for your time today and for the ability to share Cree's perspective on this important issue. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. The chair now calls upon Mr. Christopher Drew, the Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer for the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today on possible reforms to the Environmental Protection Agency's Energy Star program. My name is Christopher Drew, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Burnham Holdings. I'm also chairman of the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, an organization representing more than 320 manufacturers. Currently, our industry as a whole represents 1.3 million employees and generates $257 billion in economic activity. AHRI represents over 90% of the domestic HVACR and water heating industry and more than 70% of the global industry. Today, 160 AHRI members participate in the AHRI program, in the Energy Star program. I'm pleased to say Burnham Holdings participates in the Energy Star program and has about 100 products listed. From our experience, we've enjoyed a positive working relationship with the EPA, and we would like the program to continue as a resource consumers can rely on and trust for information on the efficiency of the products they are considering for purchase. My comments as chairman of AHRI, reflecting the concerns held by the HVACR manufacturers, are covered in greater detail in the testimony submitted for the record. The industry's concerns are related to the approach taken to move the program, compliance burdens that should be addressed, as well as ensuring the program is able to continue as a valuable and informative tool for educating consumers. AHRI and its members have concerns about the draft suggestion to move the program from the EPA, where it is currently housed, to the Department of Energy. The industry would prefer to maintain the program as it currently stands at the EPA, where it has been able to operate successfully for our products since 1992. Though no doubt well-intentioned, the draft does not provide details as to how moving the program could be accomplished without disruption. It is currently operated by a knowledgeable and dedicated staff in a way that generally ensures stakeholder input and successful outcomes. Furthermore, if moved, the draft language leaves much of the administration of the program to the discretion of the Secretary of Energy. Energy Star's credibility and success over the last 25 years has been partially driven by its stability within the EPA's portfolio and the certainty it provides to consumers that what they are purchasing is government certified. There is no false advertising. Therefore, if the program is to be moved, which is not what our industry would prefer, we would like the committee to provide more details on how it will be managed. To reduce compliance burdens, AHRI has also urged the federal government to recognize voluntary certification programs as a way to comply with federal energy efficiency standards and the Energy Star program. Relying on industry consensus certification programs reduces duplicative efforts between the federal government and industry, encourages compliance with energy efficiency regulations, reduces regulatory burdens, and saves taxpayer dollars, all while enhancing market surveillance. AHRI is currently an EPA-designated certification body. This allows AHRI program participants to realize significant savings as they are able to meet Energy Star requirements without any additional testing on the products they wish to have labeled. The draft does include a promising improvement to allow for good actors, those participants that have met all requirements of the program for a period of at least 18 months, to be eligible for reduced compliance burdens. Unfortunately, the draft makes this available only to certain products. We believe this section should be broadened to include all products, as the stated policy is to recognize those who are compliant with the program and prove themselves trustworthy, and not based on a specific product type. Additionally, while the Administrative Procedures Act is the most commonly used method of ensuring stakeholder input, Energy Star is not a regulatory process. It is a voluntary program, and applying a full APA process could create an unnecessary burden for a program like Energy Star. Ensuring proper stakeholder input and notification could easily be achieved through agreeing on a process that is transparent and predictable, without the burdens APA would place on the agency and participants. Another area of concern for our industry related to moving the program from EPA to DOE is the potential disruption it might cause to the highly successful and impactful Energy Star building programs like Portfolio Manager. Portfolio Manager is EPA's tool for building owners and managers to understand how their properties operate and how to improve their economic performance. 50% of U.S. commercial floor space uses Portfolio Manager, and it is also used by the commercial real estate industry to comply with the numerous state and local laws. In addition, under Energy Star's New Homes program, houses are designed and built with a system-wide approach in mind so that all energy efficiency systems and features work together to deliver better performance. Quality installation of these products is essential for consumers to gain the full benefits of their highly efficient equipment. Finally, sufficient funding for Energy Star is vital to the continued success of the program, no matter where it resides within the federal government. I'd like to thank the committee members and staff for being so inclusive of stakeholders and inviting comments on this discussion draft. We look forward to working with you to improve the Energy Star program and the regulatory environment for HVACR and water heating manufacturers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drew. And our final witness is Mr. Doug Johnson, and Doug is the Vice President of Consumer Technology Association. Mr. Johnson, you have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Vice Chairman Olson, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the Consumer Technology Association, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide feedback from our membership on how best to improve the Energy Star program. We thank the committee and Congressman Latta for their work in this discussion draft. CTA's membership includes 2,200 companies, 80% of which are small businesses and startups. CTA also owns and produces CES, the Global Stage for Innovation in Las Vegas in January. A large number of our members are partners in the Energy Star program, and some of them are award-winning partners. As of 2015, more than half of the electricity savings in the Energy Star products program came from electronics. Regarding energy efficiency policy, we advocate for approaches that are national, voluntary, market-oriented, globally harmonized, flexible, collaborative, and friendly to innovation and economic growth. Most recently, our efforts have included groundbreaking, industry-led, voluntary agreements for energy efficiency in set-top boxes and small network equipment. This is a great time to identify and pursue regulatory reform opportunities related to energy efficiency programs. Based on our members' experience with the Energy Star program, we have 6 recommendations we'd like to make regarding the discussion draft. First, we support the balanced and bipartisan solution to third-party certification that is part of the discussion draft bill. This solution maintains Energy Star third-party certification authority, but allows electronics manufacturers with a demonstrated track record of compliance to earn their way out of the burdensome requirement. If there's non-compliance, then the more draconian, costly third-party certification requirements reapply. It's important to keep in mind that the rigorous post-market verification system that exists today would stay in place. Second, regarding moving program leadership to DOE, we know our members' experience with EPA and Energy Star has been collaborative in some categories and less so in others. If program leadership were to move to DOE, which is used to traditional regulatory rulemakings, we would need assurances that DOE would work collaboratively in partnership with industry in the voluntary Energy Star program. Third, regarding application of the APA to Energy Star, our view is that some changes are needed to ensure Energy Star program transparency and accountability. Something selective and less restrictive than full-blown application of the APA may be best, since we want to avoid encumbering the program and undermining its ability to keep pace with the tech industry. But APA could apply in some measure to ensure due process, transparency, and rational decision-making in the administration of the program and the development of product specifications. Increasing Energy Star program transparency and accountability also could include review of program decisions by the Office of Management and Budget. Our fourth recommendation concerns the provision about application of Energy Star to products of various sizes and capabilities. A few years ago, EPA decided it could impose a cutoff based on product size for participation in the program. We think Energy Star specifications should be scalable, giving models across the board, no matter size and performance, something realistic to shoot for, and giving consumers an Energy Star option across the board as well. Our last 2 points concern topics not addressed in the discussion draft, but relevant to the Energy Star program and its administration. At times over the years, EPA has attempted to broaden the scope of Energy Star to cover non-energy factors, such as greenhouse gas emissions of manufacturing processes and supply chains, not related to the energy efficiency of the product itself. This Energy Star mission creep has appeared in past EPA proposals for new Energy Star specifications for computers, displays, and televisions. We think Energy Star should stay focused on energy efficiency. Our final point concerns standard test procedures on which Energy Star and other programs depend. DOE and EPA have hired consultants to develop test procedures for measuring the power consumption of products being considered for Energy Star specifications and, if applicable, DOE standards. This use of consultants is not only costly, but also less transparent than the open private sector's consensus standards development process. We think Energy Star program administrators should rely on these existing and less costly opportunities already developed by the private sector. In conclusion, I would reiterate that this committee's focus on Energy Star reform and improvement opportunities is important and necessary. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute our industry's views and ideas, and we look forward to further engagement with the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I thank all of you for your testimony. And now the fun begins. We'll move into member question and answers, 5 minutes per member. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And my first question is for you, Mr. Johnson. One of the provisions this bill changes is third-party verification rules in Energy Star. It creates an exemption for electronics manufacturers that are in good standing with the program. Can you go to some detail on why this is important and how we would make sure companies don't abuse this?
There are 3 thoughts along those lines that I have. One is why just electronics, as was mentioned earlier, and the Energy Star program covers something like 60 different product categories across various industry sectors. We're rather unique in the sense that we have extremely competitive time-to-market pressures in this industry, product life cycles that may only be a few months long. And to take the time and the cost at the pre-market stage to test products is a burden, a particular burden in the case of our sector. The second point I'd like to make is the track record of industry performance under Energy Star. Our industry has an excellent track record of compliance in the program. EPA acknowledged that several years ago when they imposed third-party certification on everybody in order to tackle discrete problems that could have been tackled in a discrete way, but the blanket went over everybody and we were covered as well and have been ever since. I think a tailored approach would have been better, but what we're talking about here is a balanced approach to let the good actors earn their way out of the burden, and if they mess up, then they're back in for, as the language says, at least 3 years. The third point I'd like to make is that verification, post-market verification, stays in place, and that's really important. That's testing products off the store shelf to make sure that they adhere to the requirements of the Energy Star program. We don't touch that. So I think that the tailored and balanced approach we're looking for is in this discussion draft. It's also reflected in the Senate and has been for the past couple Congresses. So we're happy to see it here, and we look forward to supporting it as it advances.
And more fun for you, Mr. Johnson. I know that one controversial issue is class action lawsuits and the Energy Star program. Can you give an example of how one of your members was impacted by a class action lawsuit and whether you think that lawsuit was appropriate? No names, just one member.
Sure, actually. This question may be best directed to another witness. This is a provision that we are not agnostic about in the sense of understanding what it's trying to accomplish, and that it would cover actually all sectors in the program. But this is not a part of the draft discussion draft that we're particularly advocating. other witnesses may have a different view.
I was going to say, that witness is Mr. Drew.
Yeah.
Any comments, sir, about how was one of your members impacted by a class action lawsuit and whether you think that was appropriate? And no names, but just has this happened, as I suspect it has, but an example of how this has gotten out of whack with class action lawsuits?
I admit I am not familiar that any of our members have been caught up in a class action lawsuit specific to Energy Star at this point in time.
Okay, another question for, well, first one for Mr. McGuire. In your testimony about EPA and Energy Star, you mentioned the problem of mission creep. And Mr. Johnson mentioned mission creep as some examples are climate change and other sorts of focuses. Energy Star's primary purpose is to help consumers save money on energy bills by identifying those products that go above and beyond mandatory efficiency standards. Give some examples like Mr. Johnson did about climate change, about mission creep happening under Energy Star. Any examples of mission creep?
There have been instances where the EPA has added performance requirements to the Energy Star specifications. In the case of dishwashers, they wanted to not only control the energy and the energy used to heat water, but how the product would perform. And they have done that in the case of clothes dryers too, and have attempted to do that in other products. They also, in the case of clothes dryers, wanted to include requirements for warranty terms. So our view is that the law that underpins the Appliance Standards Program itself requires that maximum energy is saved, it's cost-effective to the consumer, and the requirement does not jeopardize the product's functionality or performance. That's what is left up to the manufacturer dealing with the customers. They want to compete on performance and quality. This is not an area for the government to be laying on top of the energy efficiency requirements. So we've experienced it firsthand since the program was moved to EPA.
Sorry, so I missed you in the first. Any example of class action lawsuit from your members that's happened because of overreach of in the Energy Star program?
The Energy Star program has a very robust penalty system to it, where partners can be eliminated from the program. They can be required to pay compensation to consumers if the energy efficiency requirement was incorrect. And this is all put on the Energy Star website. It's very visible to consumers, to retailers. The penalty is fit to the infraction. Having a class action lawsuit on top of that adds another layer of penalty that is totally unnecessary and is not going to make the company, the partner, if you will, change its behavior because it's already doing that with regard to the penalty requirements of the program. It's just double jeopardy.
Thank you, sir. And I have 50 seconds over, so I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee for 5 minutes and 50 seconds. Mr. Rush.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Callahan, as I stated previously, the Energy Star program is one of the more popular and trusted programs that's out there, and it also is a voluntary program. So this bill that we're considering is not only unnecessary, but it will also turn a good program into a bad program. And I oppose disrupting this program by moving it from EPA to DOE. I oppose subjecting this voluntary program to the APA. I oppose undermining the integrity of the program by limiting accountability for manufacturers. And I oppose revising the third-party certification requirements that lead to fraud and abuse. That said, Ms. Callahan, in your opinion, if this bill were to become law and these changes to Energy Star were to go into effect, how would this impact the integrity of the overall Energy Star program, and how would it impact consumers' confidence in the program?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Rush. I think our concern as an energy efficiency organization is if this discussion draft, as it's currently crafted, were written into law, that it would have very, very significant damaging consequences on the program and on consumers' ability to have confidence in that program. You mentioned several things that we're very concerned with. One is a wholesale movement of the program from EPA over to DOE. Some of my fellow witnesses have talked about this, as well as members, that there's 25 years of history of brand management, of partnership relations, of IT and databases that have been built that won't be easily moved. And there's not appropriations at DOE to support that size of program. It's about $42 million at EPA currently. There's not the expertise and the staff that's there to do the brand management and the marketing. And we are very concerned that the program, even for the period of time, to dismantle an infrastructure and rebuild it over in another agency will take away from the focus of the program. So we are very, very concerned. With respect to certification, third-party certification resulted from a GAO study that found that there were folks that were not self-certifying appropriately and were basically cheating the system. So there are very good reasons for putting in that third-party certification. We're open to looking at ways to minimize burdens and costs on manufacturers, but we have to protect the integrity of the program. If consumers cannot rely on that blue label to indicate that there are energy savings and that product is top of the market, then we really lose what we have and what we've built have built over 25 years.
Well, I'm going to move to Mr. Merritt. Mr. Merritt, Energy Star is a completely voluntary program, but yet the legislation before us will apply the APA specifications to the program. What impact would that have on the Energy Star program overall and on your industry specifically?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Rush. So, as I mentioned in my testimony, the application of APA, we believe, would limit the ability of the program to be nimble and responsive to changes in technology in the market. Currently, the Energy Star program is able to make what we refer to as tweaks to the specification based on developments in the market without going through a long process of formal notification, comment period, posting, et cetera. We believe the current structure of the program allows the program to work effectively with partners and participating vendors to revise these specifications. We are concerned about making the process so long and burdensome that we aren't able to keep up with the changes in the market and the technology.
Ms. Callahan, as you know, the President's FY18 budget zeroes out the Energy Star program, while the proposal put forth by the majority would enact major cuts to it. Currently, the program is operating at $42 million pursuant to the most recent continuing resolution. What level of funding do you think is appropriate for the Energy Star program to effectively operate at, and what type of return would we see if Congress funded the program at its optimal level? And
thank you again for the question, Mr. Rush. As you mentioned, the current appropriations are about $42 million over at EPA, and DOE also contributes funding for some of the specification and the technical work that they do to support EPA. We believe that funding is insufficient to continue the program and to look at including more products, more different ranges and sizes of products. We've suggested in our testimony an authorization level and appropriation levels of up to $75 million. Historic levels for the program have been $50 million, but that's historic, and there's been no increase in funding for the 14 years that I've been at the Alliance to Save Energy. It's been roughly stable to falling, and we believe that there have been increases, of course, in the cost of living and programs going forward. So we believe that this program should grow and should have more funding than it does, and have direction from the Congress for what those levels should be, which is not currently there. The other thing that I would add to that is on the return. I think the EPA studies show that for every dollar invested, there are about $4.50 in energy savings that are realized. And as I mentioned in my oral statement, this little program that could, at $42 million a year, has driven $165 billion in private sector investment in new technology and innovation. So I think dollars here are very well spent, and it's penny wise and pound foolish to continue to decline the funding when really it should go the other way.
Thank you. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is back. The chair now calls upon the pride of Ennis, Texas, the vice chairman of the full committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're in fine form today. I appreciate this hearing and the witnesses being here. I want to make sure I'm clear on this. Mr. McGuire, this is a voluntary program, right? Manufacturers don't have to participate if they don't want to. Isn't that correct?
It is a voluntary program. However, over its 21 years in existence for home appliances, it has become, in effect, mandatory in the marketplace. Utility rebate program specified, building code specified, federal procurement specifies it, and many retailers will not carry your products if you don't have Energy Star. So while it is voluntary, manufacturers have to have Energy Star products. And what we're saying may be different from the rest is appliances began their Energy Star career at DOE for the very reason that the test procedures that allow manufacturers to test a product to see how much energy it uses, they're changing all the time because of technology. And so those test procedures are needed to determine if you meet Energy Star requirements. When it went to EPA and they began experimenting with performance and warranty terms and other non-energy features, that's where disruption and confusion occurred. So Energy Star has been great for consumers. We just want it to be stable and provide certainty so that our companies can comply with it.
All I really needed was a yes. I got a lot more than I bargained for. Well, let me go to part two of that question. The reason I wanted to get on the record explicitly that it was voluntary is because I don't think you need to have a voluntary program subject to class action lawsuits. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Okay.
That would be yes.
That's a good answer. All right. And I'll come back to you one more time. The draft discussion makes the Department of Energy the primary agency, and it to some extent redefines the responsibilities of the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency. I happen to believe, and this will surprise my friends on the Democratic side, that we need a strong enforcement capability at EPA, but I think EPA should focus on enforcement and not on setting policy. And as you pointed out, EPA more and more has used their role under the current system to move into policy areas that they really don't have in my opinion, a legitimate reason to move into. Would you agree with that?
I would, Mr. Chairman.
Good. So you're getting better at it.
I'm coachable.
Does anybody, if we were starting over, and we had never had an Energy Star program, and we created an Energy Star program, why would you not make the Department of Energy the standard setter and EPA the enforcement oversight? Why wouldn't you do that? What's wrong with that?
Well, that's the way it did begin. And that made total sense because of the technical nature of the standards and the test procedures. And all the verification testing that's done for Energy Star today is overseen by DOE because of the complicated nature. We do the verification testing. So it made total sense to have it there at the beginning. It makes total sense to have it there now for consumers and for manufacturers.
I'll go to Mr. Johnson for my last question. How long does it take to go through the system and get a product certified for Energy Star right now under the current system?
Thank you for the question. Our members report that can take a few days or a couple of weeks. But again, for an industry whose product life cycles are relatively short and measured in months, that's a significant amount of time to be off the store shelf.
Is there anybody that would state under the current system it takes an excessive amount of time to get certified? Anybody? So in terms of actual submitting your product for review, once you do it, Department of Energy and EPA act expeditiously. Is that a fair statement? Not a fair statement?
I think once, if I may, I think once you are certified, there are steps after that that take less time, but it's the time out of the product development cycle to send your product to a third party to have it tested, information to be sent to another party and back to EPA. It takes a while, and certainly in contrast to self-certification, which again worked for us quite well for many years under Energy Star and in other regulatory arenas, it's a relative burden.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now calls upon a gentleman who doesn't share Mr. Rush's admiration for the Houston Astros victory, the man from California, home of the Los Angeles Dodgers, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes. Okay.
You're right, I don't. But we can move on from that, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses and I thank the chairman this morning. Mr. Johnson, what determines an adequate track record for companies on the Energy Star program, and who should determine this?
When we talk about third-party certification improvement, I would stress that we're not talking about eviscerating the EPA's capability to have this. I think it was important for EPA to recognize, and they did when they instituted third-party certification, that we had an excellent track record, and we've maintained that after third-party certification as well. The problem we're trying to avoid is the burden that is too much for a company that wants to maybe put a product on the market that qualifies for Energy Star but doesn't want to take the time and cost involved with testing. So we've heard feedback from our manufacturer members who tell us that they may not want to pay the bill or take the time, and they'll just meet the spec and get the product to market. So we end up with a store shelf where you have Energy Star labeled products and products that meet the Energy Star spec but don't have a label because they didn't want to take the time. And I don't think that's very good for the program. And we would, still support EPA oversight, obviously, and in the case of companies that violate, and they would, of course, be subject to the requirements of third-party certification once again. So I think, if anything, we've weighted this in this language toward penalty. But I think the track record speaks for itself in this industry. We were not the problems that they were trying to address when they instituted this, and we would sure welcome a good actor's opportunity to earn our way out.
Thank you. Ms. Callahan, the 2008 Memorandum of Understanding between the DOA and the EPA helped the program. Is there any room for improvement on that MOU?
I think that it's a good thing to go back and review the Memorandum of Understanding regularly, and it's my understanding that EPA and DOE are in discussions now about that MOU and changes that may be made. There's the law, current law gives them the ability, just as it did to put in force that MOU in 2008, or I think it was 2009 actually, they can rewrite that and change and move around elements of the program to make it most streamlined and most cost-effective. So we are encouraged, and I'm encouraging stakeholders, and this is in my testimony, to work with the agencies to seek improvements to the program. We're not convinced, as the Alliance to Save Energy, that it takes a statutory change. We believe that the program can be improved and that the agencies are motivated to improve the program. So we'd like to see it happen there first.
Well, we don't have the agencies in front of us today, but you're saying that there may be a new MOU in the works.
I didn't. I said they're in discussions about ways to improve the program, sir. I wouldn't want to overstate. I've had no conversation to indicate that they're looking at and rewriting the MOU.
So how would you go about increasing the predictability in Energy Star specification settings, as you've suggested?
I think working with the stakeholders and with EPA and DOE to look at best practices and at maybe regularizing timeframes between product specifications in a way that makes sense. I think it's a bit tricky. As Doug Johnson has indicated, some of these products are changing so dramatically, the technology in the marketplace. So I think we have to preserve the flexibility, and that's working with the agencies and with the program administrators and putting in place some best practices and guidelines, to me, makes a lot more sense to keep that program flexible and nimble rather than trying to codify something into law.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire, you seem to be the only one that is favorable toward moving this back to the DOE. How would you address the concerns of the other panelists that would be disruptive of a very successful program?
Well, I'm also the only one representing an industry sector whose life at Energy Star began at DOE. All the other products started at EPA. So what I'm saying is that there was disruption when our appliances were moved to EPA in 2009, and some of the examples I cited with that created diversions and inefficiencies. We think they should be back at DOE, where they can be tied more to the standards and test procedures work and make it more predictable for our members and for the customers. And so this can be done administratively, as Kateri indicated, through a change to the Memorandum of Understanding. We would support the memorandum being changed to bring home appliances back to DOE. We would also support...
So you're just saying bring the home appliances, not the whole program back to the DOE?
We support, I'm speaking only for home appliances. We believe they should be back at DOE. I'm not speaking for the other products, the other industries.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The chair now calls upon the gentleman from the land of Lincoln, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be with you all. I may be the fly in the ointment. I've always struggled with the Energy Star issue. First of all, I think the budget is, I was told, $50 million. It's been cut to $41 million, and the president proposes $0. And Ms. Callahan, you think it should be $75 million.
Up to.
So then it's really a fundamental debate about government and kind of government's role and manufacturing and consumer choices and education. So that's why I always struggle with. I understand that eventually consumers will get lower cost, but there's a lot of gaming of the system that I don't like. I don't like the fact, and you can, if you disagree, building new homes today costs more because of these standards. Would anyone disagree with that? If you're going to purchase a new home, that cost of that home is more expensive based upon efficiency standards.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, quickly, but
Okay. Well, studies have shown that there is an incremental cost,
Correct.
but that in terms of the mortgage, reduction in the payment of the energy
okay,
costs
that gets me to my other point. Then I don't like the ROI, return on investment of 20 or 30 years from the supposed energy savings that really makes that initial purchase somewhat affordable. That will be the debate. How much energy do you save? How much money do you save? So you're willing to take the initial upfront cost. And then my problem is, what's government doing about, why is government involved with this to begin with? Why isn't it buyers and manufacturers? So has anyone heard of the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence? Anyone know what that is? All right. So ASE, when you see ads, when you go to get your car repaired, you want to go to an ASE certified mechanic, or at least that's what this institute says, because what? They're trained. Now, the ASE is short for the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence. Since 1972, our independent nonprofit organization has worked to improve the quality of vehicle repair and service by testing and certifying automotive professionals. Why does government have to do energy? Why can't we have a National Institute for Energy Efficiency, funded by you all to certify and to advertise. We'll even give you the label if you want. Why is it government's role to do this? Anyone want to answer that question? Mr. McGuire?
Well, our members probably agree with you philosophically, but we have gone through decades of energy efficiency policy at the national level that has resulted in significant energy savings. The dilemma is that if we were to wipe that federal program away, including Energy Star, you would have a patchwork of regulations throughout the country, which we experienced in the 1980s. So
let me just feed in my time. So like California may continue to go a certain route, not picking on my Californians there. They're very all into this, right? And because there's such a huge market, they may drive the rest of the country to move in that direction based upon the state standards, whereas another state may not be all in. Here, the other issue I have is when the median income of your district is $47,000, and they want to buy a home appliance, and that home appliance is now disproportionately increased for two things. One is the efficiency standards. The other one is what Mr. Johnson was talking about, I think, and this is that DOE EPA debate, is if you start putting other new concerns in the standardization and your testing, you're just going to increase the cost of the goods. So, a short story. Many people know I own a townhouse. I have renters, and I had to get a new washer. I bought the cheapest washer I could buy, and that's what we're using, because I wasn't willing to pay, and I paid probably $2,400 less than if I would have bought the top of the line, energy, super efficient, save the world piece of equipment. So I'm worried about the people who can't afford these government standards, which I don't think are needed. And I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The chair now calls upon a gentleman from California who's not happy again that my Astros won the World Series over his Dodgers. Mr. Peters has 5 minutes to speak.
First of all, that is a total mystery. You cannot call a San Diego a Dodger fan without their permission. I think you've misread this one, Mr. Chairman, and this is something on which we should be able to agree, actually.
Stand corrected.
I actually, to respond to Mr. Shimkus, I actually think this is about the least intrusive way for government to promote energy efficiency by sort of setting the table for consumers to have the information that they need to make a decision about whether they want to invest in energy efficiency. And Mr. Shimkus decided in his own, no one required him to buy the fancy washing machine, but you had the information to make that choice yourself. And I think it's actually very valuable and non-intrusive. So my question goes to that, though, which is about the certification. And Mr. Johnson, I got to read over your testimony, and you said that in 2011, they switched from this to this self-certification. We don't have the agency here. Can you tell me, if they were sitting here, why they would explain that they did that in 2011 to switch away from self-certification?
Sure. As
mandated a third-party certification regime for products.
Right. As Kateri Callahan referenced earlier, EPA around that time was dealing with a couple of challenges or issues with the program. One had to do with the database that was used at the time to administer the list of Energy Star qualified products, and that database essentially was fooled by a third-party audit that uploaded the famous gas-powered alarm clocks, right? So it was an egregious and a well-publicized situation with a database on the administrative side of the program. The other challenge, as I understand, had to do with a product category outside of our industry in the refrigerator category. Perhaps Mr. McGuire can shed further light than I can. But in any case, it was a discrete issue in a category of product outside of our industry. The response by EPA was very public and very broad, and the blanket of third-party certification went over everybody, even though at the time in their press release, EPA acknowledged that electronics have this 100% track record of compliance.
Let me ask you though about, so what would you do in the case of fraud? So let's just say that there's no, the self-certification, someone pats themselves on the back for meeting a spec that they don't in fact meet.
So I think the penalties should be there.
What would be the penalty?
In the language in the discussion draft, or
in your mind, what would be the rate?
Well, I think we favor the approach that's in this discussion draft, which on one hand allows the good actors to earn their way out, but if there's a screw up, I think in at least 2 instances, then they're back under third-party certification for at least 3 years. So I think
there's no penalty to them for all the products that they sold potentially fraudulently. In other words, just next time you have to have a certification. Is that the way you'd advocate it?
Well, in terms of allowing a focus on the new market entrants or the bad actors, I think that's really important. But for the good actors who've had that demonstrated track record of compliance, allow them to earn their way out. I think EPA or DOE would maintain the oversight of the program and essentially kick the parties out that would violate. I think there's also the consumer response as well, and there are a lot of publications and other parties that watch this space, and please note that the manufacturers have equity in this brand as well. It's a partnership fundamentally.
I'm very sympathetic, actually, particularly in your industry where things turn over so fast. My concern is that without the certification, and I'm not trying to answer the question, I'm trying to ask it, is without certification, as we go forward with this draft, how can we be confident that the standards will actually have been met? And I guess that's what I'd look at too. For myself, I also don't understand why this is not an Energy Department program. It does seem to me where that is where the expertise relies. I don't have an objection to that part of the bill. I'm not sure why EPA is the better one to set standards than the Department of Energy, but I just, with a limited amount of time I have, just expressed the concern I have about compliance, and not that I'm an advocate for litigation, but if you left the third-party certification out there, why you wouldn't want to have some sort of hammer? I don't know. You want to respond to that?
Yes, sir. The other note I wanted to make was with respect to marketplace verification post-market. When the products are on the store shelves, labeled as Energy Star, very important to keep that going. And the solution to third-party certification, which is a pre-market exercise, is distinct and separate from post-market verification. So that would be the check, the random testing of products on store shelves.
And I think there'd have to be some sort of penalties in place for actual fraud.
There are penalties.
I'm out of my time, ma'am. So, but I'm sure maybe someone else will ask you. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlemen, is back. The chair now calls upon the author of the Energy Star Reform Act of 2017, Mr. Latta from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and again, thanks to our panelists. I think it's a really good discussion that we're having, and that's why we're here today to talk about this discussion draft. And Mr. Drew, if I could just start with you. I think that everyone here believes that the Energy Star program is something that needs to be preserved. But the question is how can we improve upon it? And so my question to you was, what improvements would you see or want to do to Energy Star to make it a better program for the consumer across this country?
Thank you, sir. In general, the products that are covered by AHRI are all highly regulated. They're certified to not only performance standards, they're also certified to numerous safety standards, just due to the nature of the piece of equipment that we're manufacturing and then having installed in people's homes. The Energy Star program, as it stands, we believe is a useful tool for educating consumers about products that they don't buy very often during their tenure as either homeowners or even if they're renters or building owners. We find that the processes that we have in place to report the status of these products to Energy Star works extremely well at this point in time. Not burdening them further with any additional requirements for reporting we would believe be beneficial. The energy savings that we provide through our products from a high efficiency perspective, as stated earlier, is a consumer choice. We believe it provides real value to the consumer. The fact that numerous third-party organizations, not necessarily government affiliated, are providing incentives to purchase these products, we also view as a significant benefit to our industry, as well as the validation that moving towards higher efficiency equipment and achieving some reasonable return on that investment is a positive thing. Regarding this discussion, again, we believe strongly not moving it away from EPA is the appropriate thing to do. It's been in EPA for a number of years, works very well. We deal with other issues at DOE. We like the separation between EPA and DOE as it pertains to this particular program.
Well, thank you. Mr. Johnson, I saw in your testimony some of the manufacturers have said that EPA have made it more difficult for the larger versions of some of their products to qualify Energy Star. For one of the examples that you cited in your testimony is widescreen televisions. Can you explain how EPA is making it, pardon me, difficult for the larger versions to qualify for Energy Star and carry the Energy Star label?
Sure. From EPA's perspective, I think they were concerned about a program all about energy efficiency applying to large products that would use more energy than small products. But our feeling was that if you're going to put a bogey out there, if you're going to put a specification out there for the market to shoot for, don't you want manufacturers up and down the product line, no matter the size of the product that consumers want, to strive for that specification? So yes, this artificial cap or cutoff for televisions in an earlier television spec came up. Essentially, I forget the exact numbers, but it was something like, say, a 50-inch TV. All TVs above that would have to still meet that 50-inch TV spec, even if they were 70 inches. So it was rather unachievable because, you know, the bigger the product, the more energy. But there should still have been a scalable specification for those larger TVs to shoot for. And again, consumers demand what they demand. We love Energy Star. We think it should provide a scalable spec up and down the product line.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire, I'd like to go back and revisit the warranty language and its importance. Can you expand on that warranty language and why it's so important?
The warranty language in the draft bill?
Right.
Yes, sir. Well, we think it's a great provision which would take manufacturers, Energy Star partners out of double jeopardy. As has been said already here today, when partners are disqualified for a particular product, have a rating that doesn't qualify, there are significant penalties that they pay in terms of being pulled out of the program for a period of time, restitution to consumers for utility costs that should have been avoided. This is all made very, very public, and that's why these partners take it very, very seriously. To be exposed to a class action litigation on top of that, to add just additional punitive damages to the company really doesn't do anything as far as the behavior of the company. It is simply a double jeopardy, and it can actually be a disincentive for companies to want to participate in the Energy Star program. So we think the penalty portion of the program enforcement makes sense. There's no need to lop on top of that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and my time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The chair now calls upon the biggest fan of the Houston Astros winning the world champions, except for me in Congress, Mr. Green from Houston, Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for you and the ranking member for having this hearing. For more than 20 years, the Energy Star program has formed a foundation for energy savings and assistance for Americans of all economic statuses. The Energy Star program has resulted in millions of dollars of kilowatts saved through the highly efficient appliance manufacturing. Unlike my good friend from Illinois, I think the Energy Star program is probably one of the best programs that we have. Over the years, we've realized in this committee that energy efficiency is really an important issue. And to have a regulation like we have that's a soft regulation, we just want the manufacturers to be accurate in what they say the energy will be used. And the consumers pick it up. I think it should be, if not a goal of the national government, to give that information to folks, but also use that energy efficiency so we may not have to build another electricity generating plant. Because I know my colleague from Illinois, maybe it's because even in Texas, our energy prices are fairly low right now. But I would probably not go by the lowest price, because I look at that and see how much I can save over the life of this refrigerator or this washer and dryer or whatever. But it is a voluntary program. That's why I think this is a good example of it. And transferring it to the Department of Energy, I think, is reasonable, because it fits in what Department of Energy ought to be doing. And EPA is a regulatory agency, but they shouldn't be regulating my dishwasher or whatever. The third-party certification for Energy Star programs is initiated after that GAO report, and I think that's such a greater improvement in the program. And I like to believe companies do the right thing, but in compliance in this space, but it's always been, not always been the case. My first question to the entire panel: how do we strike a balance when it comes to self-certification in consumer electronic space, where we don't inhibit innovation under the Energy Star program, but also make sure the benchmarks that are required are being met? I know that's a tough one, but because how do you balance it? Does any of the panel have? Why don't you start with you, Mr. McGuire?
Well, I won't speak for consumer electronics, but I will simply say that to meet a DOE energy efficiency standard, the mandatory standard, which is the base, and Energy Star is above that, manufacturers have to self-certify to DOE on a very prescribed testing method that they have to provide all the data to DOE to prove that there's a reasonable chance they will be in compliance. And then DOE does verification, surveillance testing on top of that. So self-certification, government verification testing aftermarket. For Energy Star, it's third-party testing up front and verification. So if one way you could make the program more efficient would be to tie it more in with DOE for home appliances, so that the certification to meet the standard and to meet Energy Star was the same process. And then you'd have third-party verification. That'd be one way to do it.
Any other suggestions?
I guess what I would say to that is that there has to be a balance. You mentioned yourself, you need consumer protection. They need to have confidence in this. So third-party certification was put in place by EPA in response to manufacturers not being in compliance. I think what's really important here are the penalties that accrue that Joe McGuire indicated earlier. So EPA can delist products, and they can require companies to make restitution to consumers who didn't realize the energy savings that were promised to them. So I think as the committee looks at it, making sure that those protections remain while we lower costs of compliance for manufacturers is really the trick and the balance that needs to be made there. But we need that accurate certification because consumers need to be able to count on the energy savings that they assume come with that Energy Star label.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yes, sir. We agree with the idea of balance, but balance is actually reflected in this provision that's in this discussion draft concerning third-party certification. We think it's a great solution. Again, EPA retains the third-party certification authority, or DOE should it move, but the program administrators retain that authority. We're just talking about balancing a solution here, essentially targeting resources where they should be targeted to new market entrants or bad actors. But if a good actor has demonstrated compliance for a period of time, why not let that good actor earn its way out? And again, penalize that good actor should that good actor screw up a couple of times, they're back in. So I think that's the kind of balance we need here, and especially in an era of limited resources or perhaps smaller budgets. Let's hone in on what the problems are. Let's recognize where the problems are not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm out of time.
My friends, time's expired. The chair now calls upon the gentleman from the Magnolia State, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here and giving us your insight and assistance as we look at this discussion draft. And Mr. Johnson, I've got a few questions and things I want to cover with you if I can. You know, the discussion draft contains provisions providing for an exemption from the third-party certification requirements for electronic manufacturers in good standing with the Energy Star program. can you give us just I know we touched on it, but give us a short background on why these third-party certification requirements came into being and why you may think they may be gone too far?
Sure. They came into being 6 or 7 years ago in response to discrete problems in the Energy Star program outside of our sector. One set of problems related to the way the program was being administered in the database. There was an opportunity, certainly at that time, to have a targeted approach to dealing with those problems, but the easiest approach, the quickest way out, was to apply third-party certification, pre-market third-party certification to everybody in the program. So we've lived under that regime since that time. All we're talking about here is a balanced way to earn your way out of that burden, and I think that's the right way to go. It's also interesting to note that at the time EPA was proposing third-party certification for Energy Star, the European Commission, a major partner in the program over in Europe, was like-minded with the industry in the United States in saying, we don't think this third-party certification is necessary for electronics, and the European Commissioner were partners in a couple of the electronics categories. So it was a strange situation for European regulators and industry in the U.S. to be allied, but we both recognized that maybe a more tailored approach would have been better at that time.
Give me a little insight. Why is it, or what is it about the electronics products and electronics industry that makes that third-party certification troublesome or more difficult?
So our members have told us that there are a couple of reasons why it's a relative burden for them. First, it takes some time out of the product development cycle. It takes a few days or maybe a couple of weeks for testing and paperwork to clear. And for an industry such as ours, again, with products that have relatively short product life cycles, maybe they're on the market for only a number of months, 2 weeks is 2 weeks of sales, right? So we're an industry in the tech industry that's used to self-certification in various regulatory realms, including electromagnetic compatibility, FCC requirements, and so forth. So that's what we were used to. That's what we had in Energy Star, and with self-certification, we had an excellent track record. So the time to market penalty that comes with taking something out of the product development cycle for a period is a concern. The cost is there too, and I suppose for big companies the cost isn't such a big deal unless you have a big product line under the Energy Star program, then it really adds up. For a smaller company, a startup that wants to be Energy Star compliant, shouldn't we make it easier for that startup to be in the program?
And you know, sometimes critics of the provisions say that sometimes could allow manufacturers to perhaps cheat and to produce products that have the Energy Star label on them, but maybe don't meet the Energy Star requirements or standards. How do you respond to somebody making that assertion or allegation?
Well, I think for problem actors, there should be penalties. Certainly removal from the program, removal from the database, penalization through this provision in this discussion draft that you would now then be back under third-party certification for at least 3 years. That's actually weighted toward the more onerous side, I would say. But there's another angle to this, too. If the burdens to participate in the Energy Star program are too great, you could actually have companies manufacturing products that meet the spec, but don't carry the label, just they didn't want to trouble with it. They get it to the store shelf. That was a point I made earlier, but essentially, how are we supporting the Energy Star brand if the store shelf is full of products that meet the spec, but some carry the label, some don't? I don't think that's good for the brand strength.
Now, is it correct that the proposed exemption only applies to the initial certification testing and that the ongoing verification testing of compliance with the Energy Star is not affected?
That's absolutely the case, and a very good point as well. We're not changing post-market verification. That's really important. Get out there, test the products on the shelves. Our members do that to each other, but there's also organized ways of doing that now, today, under DOE and EPA, and that should continue. It's not touched by this proposal.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, is back. The chair now calls upon the gentle lady from Florida, Miss Castor.
You almost did it again.
Almost caught it. Caught myself.
There is one female here on the committee. It's not really a very good reflection of the country or even the Congress to have only one female, not many minorities. So I take this responsibility seriously to represent. And what I want to say is the Energy Star program has been a real success story for Americans and American families and businesses. Since its inception in the 1990s, it has saved consumers substantial monies. It's helped us conserve energy, which is important at a time where we want to control carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases. I thought Mr. Peters was right on when he said this is probably one of the least intrusive ways we can help put money back into the pockets of consumers and businesses, because after all, it's voluntary. And to answer Mr. Shimkus's concern over the return on investment, the return on investment for Energy Star has been impressive since its inception, and Energy Star has cumulatively saved $2.5 billion in energy costs. In 2015, homeowners saved $360 million in energy cost, approximately 30% of their energy bills. Since 1995, 1.7 million Energy Star homes have been constructed. And in 2016, approximately 92,000 Energy Star certified homes were constructed in the U.S. America is a leader here globally. The Energy Star program is internationally recognized as a proven standard for energy efficiency. A lot of the other countries are catching up, but America has been the leader, and we need to continue to be the leader. But my takeaway today from the expert testimony is just kind of what was stated at the beginning. If it's not broken, why fix it? With all of the other pressing issues here before the Congress, this is one that I think, based upon the testimony, when you look at the track record, the savings for consumers, why fix it? But we do have to be on guard, because the Trump administration did propose a total elimination of Energy Star in its last budget. I strongly oppose that. This has been a vital lifeline for cost savings for consumers and helping us conserve energy. So I want to make sure all of the witnesses are on record on that today. I'd like all of you just to answer yes or no. Do you oppose support or oppose? You can say I support or oppose the Trump administration's proposal to totally eliminate Energy Star.
Oppose.
Strongly oppose.
Oppose. Oppose.
So you would oppose to elimination as well. See, I think, and I hear what you all are saying about the shift to the DOE. Most here are opposed to that as well. I took Mr. Merritt's comments very seriously that they lack experience at the DOE to do this. I wonder, there also are going to be some significant costs if the Congress were to make this move. Ms. Callahan, do you know what it would cost to shift the program entirely from EPA to DOE?
I do not know what that would cost. I know what the budget at EPA is now. It's $42 million. I know that the entire budget at the EERE office, which is probably where it would land, is about $2 billion. There's been, the president proposed almost an 80% cut to that budget, and the House has recommended about a 40% cut to energy efficiency programs over there. So we don't see where the money comes from to support that cost and that change.
Mr. Merritt, do you have any information on what you think it would cost to shift to DOE entirely?
I do not, but I would support Ms. Callahan's comments.
Does anyone else want to comment on the potential cost of shifting and the loss of professional expertise that's currently at EPA? Yes, sir.
We don't think the cost to the federal government would be any more if the program for appliances were at DOE than EPA. I agree with the adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think it is broke when the appliance portion went over to EPA, and there have been inefficiencies there. So I would make the argument that if they were shifted back to DOE, there would be more efficiencies and less cost for running the appliance portion of Energy Star program. We want the program to be funded.
Do you have any hard data on that, any studies?
I don't have hard data. I don't think.
I think it's an open question right now, and because you would clearly incur significant costs, including hiring and training of new staffers, standing up new online data systems comparable to those at EPA to collect certification data, that allows building owners to track their energy waste and waste consumption. It's not as simple as just snapping your fingers, especially in this budget arena where, and I think Ms. Callahan's comments are very well taken, the proposed decimation of the EERE budget at DOE, and then you're going to increase costs by the shift and then probably put all of Energy Star at risk when DOE subsumes it all. I would be very concerned for consumers and our ability to put money back into their pocket in the end. But I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you,
The
Mr.
gentle lady yields back, and ma'am, if you're the only member of this committee of female, we're proud of that because you are the MVP. I've seen you chase down a ball in center field like George Springer from our Astros. He's our MVP, you're our MVP. The chair now calls upon the member from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Callahan, it's good to have you here. I've enjoyed working with you over the years I've been here in Congress. It's good to be able to continue a discussion on energy efficiency, and particularly appreciated the work over the last 7 years with you and also Peter Welch. What a great champion of that, and it's been good. I think it's been beneficial for us to be able to team up.
And we've appreciated your leadership tremendously.
Thank you. So one of the questions, I guess I'm having some concerns as well about the granting an exception under the verification. I'm a strong advocate of IV&V, independent verification and validation that we've used in NASA and elsewhere where we have someone else looking at it. I'm also familiar, having come from the construction industry, on an efficiency of dealing with UL, the Underwriters Laboratory, and Factory Mutual FM. Can any of you give me an indication, because they've been around for decades, is there an exception to UL ratings or FM? Can anyone share?
I'm being looked at, so I will respond. This is different than product safety. Energy efficiency is different than product safety. And I would note that in product safety, of course, there is third-party certification that's very important, but there's actually no post-market verification for product safety. Here with Energy Star, we're talking today about an approach that includes pre-market certification and post-market verification. It's relatively more burdensome than product safety. Should that be the case in all cases? I think we need that balance.
Maybe we're just picking nuances of this, but I'm just curious. I'm not sure that I'm going to embrace the idea of an exception on this. I've come from industry that we depend on it. When you see a UL rating, you know it's good. You know it's been done independently, and the same thing with FM. So maybe, McGuire, go back to you on some of your comments. What was broken, that Ms. Castor made that remark, what was broken in 2009 that caused the administration back in 2009 to switch from DOE over to EPA? What was broken then that they were intending to fix?
Sir, I don't know the answer. I don't know what was broken. I would submit that nothing was broken. And what happened was the program that oversaw and oversees Energy Star for appliances at EPA today became diverted from the energy efficiency mission and got into things like warranties and procurement rules and things in performance. So we'd like to fix it. We'd like to have it go back and be part of the whole appliance efficiency policy apparatus where you have the minimum standards and then Energy Star above that, and they can be coordinated as they used to be.
Okay. I just don't want anything to come in between the government or whatever and energy efficiency and Energy Star. We've made great strides with this, and I'm looking to see what's going to facilitate it the best. And that's why I was trying to understand. Can any of the rest of you share with me what was broken in 2009 that caused the administration to switch it or to flip it? Okay. Thank you, and I yield back my balance of my time.
Gentleman is back. The chair now calls upon the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this hearing. Witnesses have been tremendous. What I'd like to do is just lay out some of my concerns, and then I've got questions for each of you. The question of moving the program from EPA to DOE, I'm agnostic about things, what department does it, but I have the concerns I have are, number one, it's very disruptive to make a move. You've got established expertise in one place and in the other. Second, there's a real funding question that is really active because of the policies of the Trump administration, and that's without passing judgment on them. And then third, the continuity of the system is really important. So that's a concern I have. Will this on a practical level work, even if you think on a theoretical level it might? And I've got the APA standard issue is really about maintaining the flexibility and the agility of the current program. You get into the APA, you get lawyers involved, and it becomes a contested hearing. And what has been tremendous, I think, about Energy Star in general has been the voluntary nature of it and the cooperative nature of it. And then third, the third-party certification. We had that problem with LG when the voluntary part of it wasn't also consistent and honest, quite frankly. So how do you have confidence in the program if you're leaving it up to the applicants without review to make that decision? So those are the concerns I have, in addition to the funding issue that across the government with the new administration is all in doubt. 25% cuts pretty much across the board. So that's where I'm coming from. I think maybe we can work these out, but let me ask Mr. Drew, first of all, you've focused on the impacts of moving Energy Star to DOE. I know in the commercial building side of the program, a number of home and commercial building organizations are supportive of EPA running Energy Star and do prefer the status quo. Can you elaborate on your experience with EPA's operation of these building programs?
So we were referring specifically to the portfolio manager program. For commercial buildings, when you're buying large equipment that consumes significant amount of energy, the ability to go in and model through the portfolio manager program how the purchase of higher efficiency equipment, potentially Energy Star, is going to impact the overall energy usage, and the potential cost savings for that building owner is significant for our members.
Thank you. I don't have a lot of time. Let me ask you, Ms. Callahan, about your thoughts on the APA process as opposed to the current process.
I agree with you completely that it could add significant time and cost and complication. You're putting a formal process designed for regulatory programs that have the force and law in place on a voluntary program, and we think that that's very troubling.
And do you have any changes that you would support in the process?
Yes, we would support working with the committee, working with the agencies and the other stakeholders to look at ways that we could put in place more transparency and perhaps more discipline to the program. And so by dint of guidelines, best practices, policies to be, there's a lot that we can do that's short of what I think is a really overstep.
Thank you. And Mr. Merritt, let's go on this requiring APA procedures. Can you suggest some changes EPA has recently made to facilitate manufacturer input?
Yes, thank you. We've seen recent changes in the process to include more reliance on industry standard test procedures and standards as opposed to creating their own, which may not be as generally accepted. We've also seen some recent changes in terms of, and I mentioned earlier, having multiple rounds of specification open for comment, which allows manufacturers to be fully heard. I would support Ms. Callahan's comments that perhaps making that more consistent across the board to allow more transparency would be a good thing. I think. All right,
thank you. I've got time for one more, but that I appreciate. Mr. Johnson, the cost and the timeline of third-party certification is a burden. You think it slows product development. But I've heard the third-party certification body states it only takes about 2 weeks to certify a new product and $3,500 to do the necessary work. Is that accurate in your view?
The cost and then the time can certainly vary, but I think it sounds about right. And I would stress that 2 weeks is a big deal when your product's out in the market for only a few months.
Okay. I thank all the witnesses, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and I think we've got a lot to work with here.
You betcha. Gentleman goes back. The chair now calls upon the member from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
I thank my friend very much and appreciate it. Mr. McGuire, I've heard you testify today that the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers' position is to move Energy Star for home appliances from EPA to DOE. I have a constituent glass company that has had a very positive experience with the Windows program at EPA. Do you see any challenges in keeping certain programs like the Windows program at EPA while moving the home appliances program to DOE?
Sir, my answer would be that for 13 of its 21 years of existence, the Energy Star program for home appliances were at DOE and not EPA. So I don't see any issues with appliances being shifted back to where they started from if other products are not. I think EPA and DOE both have had responsibilities in the program, and the important thing about appliances is that the efficiency levels and the testing is so integrally tied to the standards and test procedures. The expertise at DOE is there to deal with that. So we may be a unique case in terms of how our standards and Energy Star requirements are intertwined.
I'm going to go a little off of the subject matter, but I'm going to ask you some questions based on some communication I've gotten from a constituent who has spoken to me numerous times about this problem, and it deals with our Energy Star program. And that is that she's not completely convinced that what we're doing is actually beneficial in the long term. And she brings up her washing machine. That is her issue. Anita of Tazewell County has asked me to ask these questions over a course of the last year or so because she believes that in order to get a higher efficiency rating, that her washing machine, a top loader machine, was designed so that it didn't put as much water into the machine. And she didn't feel like her clothes were getting as clean. And so what happens when somebody doesn't feel like their clothes are getting as clean, you figure out some way. I've heard stories of other people who have done more loads of wash in order to, so they put less clothes into the machine. In her case, she babysits the machine, as she told me, and she has a contraption hooked up with her garden hose, and she adds additional water to the washing machine because the machine, apparently, if you interrupt the cycle at a certain point, doesn't realize that you're putting more water in, and it'll heat all the water. And it seems to me that maybe we ought to be looking at a total efficiency and not just the energy rating, because if people are doing more loads of laundry or stopping the machine after it's gotten started and filled up to a certain point and then adding additional water to the machine, doesn't seem to be very efficient. I should note that I do have a picture here, probably can't get picked up on the camera, of Anita with her device filling in the washing machine with additional water. So what do you say to folks like Anita who say, wait a minute, in fact, the heading on her email was, get the EPA out of my laundry room. It's destroying our consumer washing machines.
Well, we take her concerns very seriously, and as I mentioned earlier, the law that governs how the standards are set says you have to balance energy efficiency with cost effectiveness and the performance of the product. And so this problem can occur at both the standard level and Energy Star. At some point, there is a diminishing return on the energy savings and the performance of the product. We saw that 3 years ago with dishwashers, where the proposed standard level would not clean a load of dishes. And so to have an Energy Star level above and beyond that made no sense. That's why those decisions need to be made at DOE and be based on fact. So we want consumers to be happy with our products. We want our products to work. And that requires that people who set standards and develop test procedures understand how these products work and the laws of physics.
I appreciate it. Mr. Johnson, I think you touched on this a little bit in some of your testimony earlier too, not directly, but close to it. Do you have something to add to that?
Only that our products are using zero amount of water today. We're very efficient in the energy sense, of course, and take great pride in this program. Want to make sure it continues. Are open-minded if Congress should decide to move this energy efficiency program to the Department of Energy. We will work hard to make sure it's successful. We do have questions. We have relationships. We're used to doing business with the EPA. But again, these relationships can be redeveloped. There's a lot of passion behind the program. We want to carry that wherever it goes.
All right. I appreciate it and yield back.
Gentleman is back. The chair now calls upon a gentleman from the home of the Hawkeyes, Mr. Loebsack, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They had a great victory over Ohio State last weekend, too. I didn't realize when I got elected to Congress that there'd be so much levity at these hearings sometimes. Thank you for your comment about water. I appreciate that. I do want to follow up with one of my previous colleagues' questions, if I may, Mr. Johnson. I'm not sure that you completely addressed Mr. McNerney's question about sort of track record. What's a good track record? How do we define that in your instance, your case?
Sure. I mean, a good track record of compliance, in my mind, is certainly one where there's no egregious examples of failure, of producing Energy Star qualified products but not quite meeting the requirements. And I'm not talking about paperwork violations, I'm talking about egregious acts. So when I say 100% track record of compliance, I'm taking that characterization directly from EPA at the time it instituted third-party certification for everybody.
Right. Does anybody else want to comment on that particular issue? Your thoughts about that? Because that's part of what we're talking about here. Did you want to say something, Mr. Mayor?
I would just add that we have seen instances in our industry, in the lighting industry, of vendors claiming Energy Star compliance that did not have Energy Star compliant bulbs or products. So we consider the cost and timing of third-party certification to be worth it in order to protect the brand.
To avoid fraud and abuse in the first instance, right? Yeah, and I have to say, I think the Energy Star program has saved consumers money. It's lowered greenhouse gas emissions, as was mentioned by Ms. Castor. I think it's been a great program. I have a lot of appliances that are Energy Star, and they save us a lot of money every month. Part of the issue, of course, is the upfront cost for some of these, but I think it's a great idea. One of my colleagues already mentioned UL, Underwriters Laboratories. It's a company that does third-party certification. We can't forget that they're in some people's districts as well. And UL is in my district. They've got a lab in Newton, Iowa, and they employ over 100 folks. And I think that's something that we do need to take into account, when we're making policy. Obviously, we're talking about energy savings. We're talking about making sure we're doing the right thing from a regulatory standpoint. But I think we do have to look at the bigger picture, too, when it comes to jobs. After all, that's a big part of what we're trying to do here in the Congress, make sure that we create jobs, save jobs, and do the right thing on as far as our constituents are concerned and the country is concerned on that front, too. So I did want to bring that up as well. I also want to agree with some of my colleagues that, I guess to use the word agnostic that I think Mr. Welch used, that's how I am about sort of transferring this to the Department of Energy, so long as we can do the right thing, so long as we can make sure that we have compliance and that there isn't the fraud and abuse. I think that's the most important thing, and I do want to reiterate, when we talk about the cost of regulations and the cost of government, moving from one agency to another, there can be a lot of costs associated with that. And I just want to make sure that we understand that before any decision gets made to move these obligations from one department to another. It's not simple. It may be theoretical, but we have to think about it pragmatically as well. Ms. Callahan, did you want to address also the issue of transparency and discipline? I know that Mr. Merritt did, but would you like to add to that at all?
Sure. What I would like to say in front of that, though, is I was looking through my papers to see how many jobs are actually in your district that are related to energy efficiency. There are 2.2 million jobs in the U.S. that are within the energy efficiency arena. So I think you make a very good point there. With respect to transparency and certification, we want to make sure that there's a balance and that consumers are protected and they can continue to trust in the label. If we can find ways to make the program less costly for compliance and relying on third-party certifications and industry standards versus having EPA or DOE create their own, we want that. We want to take down the cost in the program, but it has to be balanced with making sure that we keep the integrity of that Energy Star label intact.
Ultimately, for the sake of consumers.
Right.
That's the bottom line.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the panel, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlemen, it's back. The chair now calls upon the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, how are you feeling today?
Very good, thank you.
How are your math skills today?
What they were when I walked in here, so I thought they were pretty good, but you've got something for me.
Well, I've been working on a mathematical equation here. 11 minus 1 would be how much?
I believe that is 10. I'm sure you're
10,
talking
okay.
about World
That's
Series.
That's what I'd gotten to, and I was just trying to figure out how many more World Series championships the St. Louis Cardinals have won than the Houston Astros. So you have now answered my question, and thank you. I want to start down on the end with Mr. McGuire, and I have a question for everyone. I just want to move down the row and get a quick response to my question. One of the goals of the Voluntary Energy Star program, as set out in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, is to reduce pollution, which we all want, like Johnny Morris of Bass Pro Shops in the 7th District of Missouri says. We all live downstream. We all want to reduce pollution. Mr. McGuire, starting with you and coming down the line, can any of you tell me what effect or how it would hurt if to move from EPA back to DOE where this program was originally? And there's been a lot of talk today about moving it and why they moved it in 2009 and how hard it'd be to move it back, when the ones that are arguing to not move it back are the ones that moved it in 2009. But can you give me any reason why moving it to Department of Energy for an Energy Star program would have any effect on pollution, good or bad, compared to EPA?
It would not impact it.
Okay.
So I want to make sure that we're clear. Joe and the appliance manufacturers are looking at moving back the appliance portion. Energy Star program is much bigger and broader than that. We believe that it would do damage to move the entire program, which is what's in the discussion draft now, back over from EPA to the DOE program.
In what regard, what way?
Well, because there's 25 years of history of databases of partnership relation and management, brand management that are going on, and people are relying on that program and on how it's being administered. And to pick that up and move it will have cost associated with it.
Who was that 25 years administrated under?
Pardon?
Who was the 25 years you're talking about?
With the EPA. This has been a shared program since it was created in 1992, and that a large portion of the program has been always over at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned during my testimony, our primary concern is continuing the viability and smooth operation of this program. We would be concerned that any change that would disrupt that operation and the implementation of the specifications in the marketplace could actually reduce its effectiveness, which would increase electrical consumption, which would affect pollution, if you want to make that connection.
Yeah, from AHRI's perspective, our comments would echo those of Mr. Merritt and Ms. Callahan. We've successfully operated this program within the EPA's structure for numerous years. And the idea that if it was disruptive moving it from DOE to EPA initially, why wouldn't it be disruptive moving it, just as disruptive moving it back, if not more so at this point in time, with a much larger program at stake?
I don't have a view on the pollution impacts. I tend to doubt it would have an impact. We're not agnostic about moving it to DOE. We understand the reasons why. If Congress decides to do so, we'll work hard to make sure it's successful. We're used to doing business at EPA. That's where our relationships are. But it's not to say we can't recreate success over at DOE.
Mr. excuse me, Mr. Johnson, the discussion draft contains a provision that would make the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act apply to actions taken under Energy Star, but critics of this provision say it could damage the program by slowing it down. As the maker of products that need to get to the market quickly, do you see this as a problem?
I see it as a potential problem. We certainly want to maintain program agility and flexibility. That's really important for the fast-moving consumer tech sector. But I think there are ways to do that while bringing on perhaps a few more checks and balances. Process aspects of the APA perhaps could be applied to the program. Third-party oversight within the federal government, such as a role for OMB, is something to consider as well. So on this provision, we'd welcome working with the committee to maybe target this a little more appropriately for our sector.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for being here for your testimony today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman is back, and I want to inform the gentleman that I just got a text from Mayor Alan Owen of Missouri City, Texas, the Show Me City. He says, please come down to our victory parade this Saturday barbecue in Missouri City for our Houston Astros, the world champs. He said, yes, it's our first, but we have to start somewhere. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. I was curious what happens other places. I'm sure you're familiar with these kinds of incentive programs or Energy Star-like initiatives in other countries, or have some sense of that, and I'm interested how we compare to that, whether the analogous regime around labeling energy-efficient products is mandatory in other places, voluntary. So I just want to get some context for that as we kind of figure out what the best way to do this is here. And then I'm also interested in any interplay that occurs. I mean, in terms of manufacturing products, again, an Energy Star rating here, pursuant to this program, as those products go into a Canada or into Europe or other countries, what's happening? Is Energy Star being converted into some other rating that's given in those countries, et cetera? So I'm just trying to get a little bit of a kind of peripheral vision on the issue. And anybody who feels competent to answer the question, I invite them to do that. Yes?
So the Energy Star program is really recognized globally as the gold standard for public-private partnerships in this area. And in fact, it is licensed and used in the European Union, Canada, Japan, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, and Thailand. And the government of Canada has weighed in to encourage the Congress to continue the program and continue funding to the program. They're in opposition to the administration's request to eliminate the program. It really is the gold standard around the world.
Any other comments? Yeah.
The Energy Star program in Canada is licensed to the NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, by the Energy Star program. So they will adhere to the specifications for the most part that happen in the U.S. So our members are very familiar with it. I would note that in Canada, the Energy Star program is housed within the Appliance Standards program of Natural Resources Canada, similar to what we are suggesting be again the case for DOE.
Go ahead.
Sure, it's very important to us, the consumer technology industry, to have policies and programs for energy efficiency that are generally aligned and harmonized around the world. Energy Star is an example of something like that. We also have these industry-led voluntary agreements that have been picked up in 3 regions of the world as well. So we appreciate when there is that globalization of an approach that, again, for us, is innovation-friendly.
So sounds like the U.S. and the Energy Star program is a leader, a global leader in setting standards like this and driving that kind of label other places. Is there any competing, you mentioned some countries in some parts of the world, are there some competing energy efficiency labeling programs out there, or would you say that kind of Energy Star's up here and everybody else is down here?
I can respond to that. There are a large number of standards and labeling programs around the world, and that is actually part of the challenge that we have. If you look in the back of a product, you see examples of many different kinds of labels, maybe not for energy, but that's what I'm talking about, is a proliferation of labels. It is so much easier for either a small or a large company that wants to sell around the world to have one test, one designation, one label, an aligned program. That's what we strive for in the tech industry.
Has Canada, for example, or other countries that use the Energy Star rating, have they offered up any testimony that you're aware of or perspective? Have they weighed in at all about the discussion that we're having here in terms of any changes to the program? Do they have anxieties about it, or are they just kind of sitting back and watching, from what you know?
We've discussed it with NRCan, and they don't have any anxieties that I know of. They were more in a listening mode, but they certainly are aware of what we're suggesting.
We've had no discussion with them on the discussion draft. Where I know their concerns lie is in keeping the program going, keeping it funded and not eliminating the program.
Great. Thanks very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now calls upon the gentleman with the home of the Hidden Lake Gardens, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
You've done your homework, and the victorious Michigan State Spartans as well. I appreciate the hearing today. Mr. McGuire and Mr. Johnson, I'd like your comments on what has been the experience of your member companies when it comes to having opportunities to comment on actions taken under Energy Star and access to the data used by the government on which to base its decisions, and is there room for improvement? Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, sir. It's been our experience that at EPA, they are very inconsistent with demonstrating the data that they have used to make their decisions, in responding to suggestions and data that we have submitted, and providing a consistent amount of time for us to comment. So there's question marks left at the end of the day, and that is why we feel that applying some Administrative Procedure Act process improvements would make it more repeatable and understandable for the people that have to make the investments in their products for the consumers to benefit from the energy efficiency gains.
Be a little more specific under the Administrative Procedures Act. Where would you go with that?
A specified period for comments, that you have this many days to comment, and that if a decision is reached that might result in you a specification you feel unwarranted or not justified by the facts, that you would have the ability to appeal that to someone else in the agency other than the person that made the decision. So we're not talking about loading up litigation. We're talking about due process so that we can understand how the decision was made.
Okay. Mr. Johnson?
I have similar comments. Our experience has been, our members' experience in some Energy Star product categories has been good and not so good in others. I think there definitely is room for improvement. We want data-driven outcomes. We have experienced outcomes with Energy Star specifications that don't seem linked so much to the data as to maybe a feeling or a passion in a different direction. So some amount of the rigor of the APA may be appropriate to guarantee certain checks and balances and timelines. However, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to encumber the program. So we have to be, I think, selective, at least for our sector, in determining what of the APA makes the most sense, and then what else might be a good check or a balance against outcomes here.
But you believe that we could improve upon the opportunities for the manufacturer input without slowing the program down?
I think we can. Yes.
Okay. Mr. McGuire?
I think with certain processes added that are included in the Administrative Procedure Act that can be improved.
Okay. What's your reaction to the administration's FY 2018 budget request, which zeroed out the Energy Star program? If you answered that earlier before I got here, forgive me for that.
I did. We oppose zeroing out the program. We want it to be maintained and appropriately funded.
Mr. Johnson?
CTA doesn't have a position on budgetary matters, but in the situation where on one hand you have elimination of the program, on the other hand you have status quo, don't touch a thing, we're kind of in the middle. There's room for improvement, and let's work on that.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back that we've saved the best for last. The chair calls upon Mr. Tonko of New York for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate that assessment. Welcome to our witnesses. Energy Star is a program that benefits consumers, manufacturers, and the environment. We've heard all the statistics about the program's success, so I won't belabor the point. But it is clear that the Energy Star label, which is recognized by 90% of consumers, is trusted. Supporters of the discussion draft have discussed how increasing transparency and accountability are important to the future of the program. But I believe the most important issue to maintain the integrity of the program is, without a doubt, upholding its well-respected brand with consumers. We should not take consumer support for the brand as a given. Ms. Callahan, a question for you, and before I do that, let me state what an honor it is to serve on the board of Alliance to Save Energy in my pre-congressional days and now in my congressional tenure, so I thank you for that.
Thank you. We really appreciate your leadership up on Capitol Hill, but we miss you a lot. When you were a fiduciary board member, we saw a lot more of you.
There you go. So the question, and I'll ask this of all, if we could kind of stick to a yes or no. Do you agree that upholding the integrity of the Energy Star label is essential to the success of the program?
Yes.
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 Yes. Thank you. And in March 2010, GAO found the Energy Star program in a report that was shared to be vulnerable to fraud and abuse. In this report, there were many concerns expressed, and at that point, many products were able to be self-certified. So in 2011, EPA responded to GAO's report and required third-party certification. Ms. Callahan, if we go back to self-certification and these issues reemerge, do you think a future report like this one I'm holding would hurt the Energy Star brand?
I absolutely believe it would hurt the Energy Star brand to have a report like that. It hurt it the last time, it would hurt it again.
Mr. Merritt, do you agree?
I do.
So, Mr. Drew, the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute is a certification body for testing products. Are certification bodies also responsible for conducting aftermarket verification testing?
We do not only certification testing for all new products entering the market, we also do annual verification testing done on a random basis selected from that manufacturer every year.
Thank you. And there's been a lot of discussion at this hearing about third-party certification and the removal of third-party certification. If that were done, who would be responsible for market surveillance? Anyone?
I guess I will answer. The market surveillance and aftermarket verification is currently the responsibility of EPA, and I would presume that that would continue.
Okay, so if we didn't have that third-party certification falling to the EPA, that would require additional spending for the EPA, which has already been threatened with some budgetary cuts. So I think we need to see that one for what it is. Mr. McGuire, were you going to?
I was just going to say EPA's third-party verification requirement is a responsibility they put on their partners, so that AHRI and AHAM do the verification, third-party verification testing with independent laboratories each year. So those costs are being borne by the manufacturers, the partners, not the public, not by EPA.
Can I clarify that?
Sure.
There are significant costs, though, that EPA does bear to certify these third-party creditors and also the verification of the project in the marketplace. So there are very significant costs, and EPA has that up on its website.
Thank you. And in the 2010 GAO report, EPA officials stated that limited resources made it difficult to do aftermarket product verification. Not to mention, at that point, consumers may have already bought a fraudulent product. Mr. Merritt, is that why you do not support removing third-party certification in conjunction with the warranty provision?
That's very much part of it. Essentially, third-party certification prior to listing ensures the integrity of the results. Relying on post-market certification enters a lottery that many bad actors are willing to enter, that their odds of getting caught are very low.
Thank you. I'll just add that according to one certification body, some types of products fail about 15% on first-time new model submissions. So Energy Star succeeds because it is truly a partnership between industry and our government. Removing third-party certification would place all the burden on the government to review submitted information, potentially conduct after-market verification, and could result in eroding trust in the program. So decades have been spent building consumer recognition and confidence in the Energy Star label. I would encourage us not to put that at risk. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your patience. Lots of comments about my love for my Houston Astros, and also an impromptu math lesson from Mr. Long. I have 18 documents I'd like to submit for the record, and very briefly, a statement in support of H.R. 3777 from Congressman Buddy Carter, an EPA testimony of the Energy Star Reform Act discussion draft, DOE's statement on E-Star of Acting Secretary Daniel Simmons, letter from the American Council of Independent Laboratories, letter from the U.S. Green Building Council, letter from the American Public Gas Association, letter from the U.S. Real Estate Industry, letter from the Enterprise Association, American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy, comments on the Energy Reform Act discussion, letter from Spire, E4, the future comments on the Energy Reform Act discussion draft, National Electronic Manufacturers Association, NEMA's comments on the Energy Star Reform Act, NEMA's comments on proposed language changes. C, letter from the High Performance Building Coalition, letter from Lowe's, letter from the Air Conditioning Contractors of America, letter from the ranking members to the chairman, and a GAO study on the Energy Star program. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. As for the witnesses, have the responses to us within 10 days as well upon receipt of the questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. Whoa, it spilled. Perfect.